Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the final video in our Easter Apologetics series. Today we celebrate the climax, the pinnacle of the Christian faith, of our faith. And while a lot of focus is spent around the Christmas season, Christmas Day, for the birth, the first advent of our Messiah, of Jesus Christ, the Lamb, sacrificial Lamb who takes away the sins of the world, the pinnacle of the Christian faith is an event that happened about 2,000 years ago on this day of the week. And that, my friends, is the resurrection. You see, the early apostles, the early disciples, those people in the first century, they didn't establish Christianity based on a belief set. They established Christianity based upon an event. And I believe it was Billy Graham that said the resurrection is the most important event in human history. And so today we celebrate the risen Savior. He is risen. He is risen indeed. And because of that, I wanted to take this last video in our series, this 4-part series, to go over what's called the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. And in doing so, we're actually going to look at some theories about the empty tomb. The theories about the empty tomb. Now, the minimal facts approach to the resurrection isn't something that I've developed, but it was something that was developed by an individual graduate from Liberty University, which is a heavy apologetics school. A man by the name of Dr. Gary Habermas, and he has a couple books on the resurrection, and I highly encourage you to add it to your theological library, because these are some of the strongest evidences of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so what this is basically this approach considers only the data that is so strongly attested historically that they're pretty much granted by every scholar who studies the subject, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, even the cynical or the skeptical and the atheistic ones that are researching this area. These are facts that are believed to be historically true, whether you're a theist or an atheist or agnostic, whatever the case is, because there's overwhelming evidence that they are true. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these. You see, with the abductive, the minimal facts approach, there's as many as 12. There's as many as 12 historical facts that the general consensus is that they are true. For instance, Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus was buried in the tomb. His death caused despair and hopelessness to the believers, to the disciples. The tomb was found empty. The disciples experienced seeing the resurrected Jesus. The disciples were transformed boldly into bold Christians. The resurrection was the central theme of their message. That the disciples preached Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem, the heart of it all. That the church was born and it grew rapidly. That even Orthodox Jews believed in Christ and changed from their Sabbath worship to a Sunday worship. That James, the half-brother of Jesus, was converted to the faith, and Saul of Tarsus, later renamed to Paul, who is a highly esteemed Pharisee, was converted to Christianity. Now, these are as many as 12 historical facts that the general population that actually studies the subject grants and says, okay, these are historically accurate. We're only going to look at 4 of these for the sake of time. I encourage you to look up Gary Habermas. Some of the information is also found on Frank Turek's website, crossexamine.org. But we're going to look at 4. Jesus died by crucifixion. The tomb was found empty. People saw Jesus physically resurrected. And the Christian religion grew rapidly. We're going to look at these. What we're going to do in a previous video of mine, I have talked about abductive reasoning, to where whenever we have an event or a circumstance that happened, we look at all the possible reasons or all the possible scenarios or all the possibilities on how such and such happened. And then we determine what is the most plausible, most reasonable explanation to that situation. And in the past video, we talked about like J. Warner Wallace's account as far as looking at a crime scene. Either an individual was murdered, it was suicide, it was natural, or an accident. And based upon different evidences that we see and we find, we can rule out some of the things to find the most reasonable explanation for an event. Now, with this approach, while secularists will grant truth to historical accuracy to these things, is going to be very difficult, as you're going to see, for a naturalist or a materialist, or someone that believes only in empirical data to believe this. And we're going to talk about that at the end. But first, number one, the first one that's commonly most everybody believes on is the fact that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. Now, we have all the gospel writings that describe the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We even have Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews that talks about him being crucified under Pontius Pilate. We also see in the Roman historian Tacitus and the Annals, the evolution of Samosata, which writes in actual parody play, Death of the Peregrine, of these same accounts. So most scholars, most researchers grant the fact that Jesus Christ not only was a real person, but that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified around AD 30-33, somewhere around there, by Pontius Pilate. So that's the first fact, that if you just remember these 4 facts, put them in your apologetic toolkit, they'll be helpful in helping people understand the truth and the veracity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. John Dominic Crossan, who was an atheist and converted, and I think he's a priest in Catholic Church, says that Jesus Christ was crucified is as sure as anything historically can ever be. So with each of these, we're going to look at, like I said, the empty tomb theories. We're going to look at the theories on, did Jesus Christ actually die of crucifixion? And one of the rebuttals to this one, although it's a historical fact that most people believe, you're going to have critics that say, no, this isn't the case. As far as Jesus' death by crucifixion, you'll hear commonly what's referred to as the swoon theory. Swoon, S-W-O-O-N. Well, you can read. But basically what this is the fact that people believe that Jesus Christ didn't actually die on the cross, but the fact that Jesus Christ was pretty much like half dead. He was near an inch of his life. And when they laid him in the tomb, that the cool air resuscitated him and allowed him to recover. So it only appeared that Jesus died. Later, he actually resuscitated, got his wits together again, and then, walked out of the tomb. Now, there are some things that can't be explained by this theory. Number one, those that hold this theory, it ignores everything that we know about Roman history as far as the crucifixion process. And even still, the fact of Jesus being flogged prior to his crucifixion, most people actually died under Roman flogging back then. If you've seen the movie The Passion of Christ, I believe that is very real as far as what Jesus Christ did and went through for you and I. And so most people would actually die during that flogging. Jesus Christ didn't die because that wasn't his time or place to die. And so the Romans knew how to kill people on the cross upon crucifixion. And so they would be certain that Jesus Christ was dead. That's their method. Plus, the other thing is the fact that Jesus Christ was a nuisance to Rome, to the Jews, to the leadership there. And so they would make sure that this individual was dead. They would make sure there's no possibility of him actually being alive and continuing this being a nuisance to the area. If Jesus faked his own death, it completely contradicted his entire teachings on ethics. Jesus Christ was always talking about being the truth, telling the truth. He said he is the truth. He is the visible embodiment, the essence of truth. And if he simply faked his death, number one, he lied because he had told the disciples and others that he will raise again. He even told the Pharisees that, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again. So that completely contradicted his ethical teachings. It's also inexplainable how a half-dead, resuscitated man can move not only the giant stone that was covering the tomb, but also overpower the Roman guards that were at the tomb entrance. Remember that Pilate had put these guards at the entrance to make sure that Jesus' body wasn't stolen or anything like that on the request of the Jewish leadership. And so this would have to explain that not only was this individual flogged and he was crucified, he has a pierced hole in his side, crown of thorns on his head. He resuscitated, came back to life, moved that giant stone, beat up and overpowered and overcame a few different Roman soldiers and guards, and then left. Highly, highly, highly doubtful. Also, there's no biblical references to a wounded Jesus. You would imagine during that time, whether it's Tacitus or whether it's Josephus, somebody because Josephus wasn't a believer. He was actually a Jewish traitor that went for Rome. But that you would imagine that somebody would have written about a wounded Jesus coming out of the grave, as opposed to this superstition that arose by people believing he resurrected from the dead. There's no extra biblical references. German theologian David Strauss writes this, and I really love what this has to say. He says, "It's impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror of death and grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and death, and at the most could only have given an elegiac voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm or elevated their reverence into worship." What he's saying here is the fact that if this was just a wounded Jesus coming back, there's no way this wounded individual would have gotten the worship, would have gotten the trust, the faith, the boldness to go ahead and proclaim this message, because he would have just been any other mortal person that possibly survived. Then if you were to look at the American Medical Association, they're on record as saying that, accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. The fact of water coming out of Jesus, the fact of his time period being on the cross, I believe it was from 9 in the morning to about 3-ish in the afternoon that he was on the cross for those many hours, 6 hours I believe it is. The fact of what he went through with flogging. Even the American Medical Association says nobody would be able to withstand that treatment and survive based upon what we know of medical knowledge today. What's the second fact? Okay, so we know that Jesus Christ died by crucifixion. Number 2, the tomb was discovered empty. This is a fact that is, well attested to. All the gospel writings, the eyewitness accounts, each discover and mention that the tomb was discovered empty. It was mentioned, it was preached, it was declared in the heart of Jerusalem. It was declared that women found the empty tomb, not men. The early church and even secular writings declare that this empty tomb was a superstition. Okay, so they say that there was this superstition, this legend, if you will, that the tomb was empty and Jesus rose. And in that day, in that location, because it would have been in Jerusalem, this is where the message was proclaimed, it would have been very easy to squash the superstition if they only provided the body. So what is the critic's naturalistic explanation? Well, either A, the disciples misplaced the body, or B, the disciples or somebody stole the body. They say that the women went to the wrong tomb, or the disciples stole the body of Jesus, or somebody did. And now this has a lot of problems within its theory as well. Number 1, the burial tombs were known locations during that time period. Again, the fact that Jesus was such a nuisance to Rome and to the Jewish leadership, they would have been sure that not only was he dead, but that his body wasn't stolen and it was accounted for. Number 2, the women knew precisely where Jesus' body was because they had anointed him and laid him in the tomb days before. And so they knew where Jesus' body was. This tomb, this sepulchre, was the sepulchre of a prominent Pharisee, namely Joseph of Arimathea. Even the Jewish leaders and many others would know where Joseph of Arimathea's body was. So if it's the fact that they believed that somebody misplaced the body, they could have went to Joseph's tomb and discovered, nope, there he is right there, superstition squashed. But that didn't happen. Jeffrey Lauder's Philosophy of Religion says that the burial of Jesus in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb has a final probability. The fact that, as Scripture records, Joseph of Arimathea gave his tomb for the burial of Jesus, they knew where that plot was. Another thing, the disciples were shocked when they saw the resurrected Jesus. They were surprised. They were amazed. They didn't believe it at first. To steal the body and claim a resurrection went against everything that they've experienced behaviorally, because when Jesus Christ revealed himself to them, they didn't even believe he resurrected. They thought he was a ghost. Also, it goes against everything that the disciples thought they knew about the resurrection. You see, in Judaism and in the Old Testament, we see in the book of Daniel, I believe it's in chapter 12, 11 or 12, where it talks about the resurrection on the final day of judgment. And so the disciples would have only believed and understood a resurrection so far as that last day. And so it went against everything they knew theology-wise in the Old Testament and the Tanakh. And so the fact of them stealing the body to claim a resurrection, they would have had no indication, they would have had no theological knowledge to try to steal the body and claim this was the resurrection promised in the Old Testament, because to them, they didn't even understand the first advent of Jesus Christ. Also, Roman soldiers, supposed to be soldiers, Roman soldiers were commanded to guard the tomb to assure Jesus wasn't stolen, to continue the uprising. These Roman soldiers, for fear of death, because their lives depended on it, would have assured that Jesus' body was in that tomb prior to them even guarding it. There's no way a ragtag bunch of disciple misfits who were defeated and demoralized on that Saturday would have been able to overpower the Roman guards, especially if the Roman guards had the weapons, had the training, and then to steal the body. Also, a stolen body or a misplaced body does not explain the conversion of Paul or James, the half-brother of Jesus. These two were non-believers. Paul may have killed Christians. At least we know he was arresting and imprisoning people. As a regarded Pharisee, it took a lot for Paul to convert to Christianity, namely for Jesus Christ to appear to him on the Damascus Road. Same thing with James, the half-brother of Jesus. He didn't believe Jesus was God, his Messiah. But something happened to him. It wasn't the fact of a body was stolen or a tomb was misplaced. What would it take for you to believe that your brother or your sister is God? What would it take for you to believe if your brother or sister was truly God? You see, to James, the half-brother of Jesus, the physical resurrection was proof to him that Jesus was who he said he was, Emmanuel, God with us. And that was enough to convert him to Christianity. The third fact, Jesus appeared alive to many disciples after his resurrection. You see, the Gospels record the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Even Acts talks a little bit about it. The disciples didn't act like they believed the resurrection. They acted like they knew the resurrection, and they died for that truth. What's also fascinating is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul actually recites a very early creed among disciples that appears only to be maybe a few years divorced from the crucifixion date. He says here in 1 Corinthians, "For I delivered unto you that which I also received." And this is the creed here. That Jesus Christ died for our sins according to Scriptures, and that he was buried and he rose again the third day according to Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, or Peter, then of the 12. After that he was seen of about 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present alive, but some have fallen asleep, dead. After that he was seen of James, half-brother of Jesus, then of all the apostles. And last of all, he was seen of me also as one born out of due time. This is an early creed, an early saying, an early, if you will, dogma of the early disciples, just a couple years after the crucifixion date that Paul records, that is in, not publication, but that is around. So how do naturalists explain this? Well, they have what's called the hallucination theory. Basically that these disciples, all these people hallucinated and actually thought they saw the resurrected Jesus. But there's some issues with this theory as well. Number one, you could talk to, pretty much any psychologist and they'll reveal how hallucinations are personal. They're personal visualizations. I can't talk right now. They're personal visualizations or sensations that someone experiences. The majority of them are actually conjured up from memories in our brain and our thoughts in our minds. And so you and I, we won't hallucinate the same exact thing the same exact way with the same verbiage and everything else. Not only did over 12 disciples, women, and everything else see Jesus' resurrection, see him physically alive again, over 500 people at one time saw the resurrected Jesus. This is complete contrary to everything we know of psychology 2,000 years later today. This doesn't even account for how Jesus was able to eat food in front of them, to have the food disappear. It's not that like we see on Casper the Ghost or whatever, some of those ghost shows where they eat the food and it just falls out of their body. No, Jesus literally ate the food and it was gone. It disappeared. His body physically rose. It doesn't account for how he was able to do that. It also doesn't align with the disciples' theological beliefs. Again, we already talked about this a little bit. They didn't understand a first advent, the resurrection of Jesus Christ here. They thought it was in the end. And so if they would have hallucinated based on their preconceived notions in their theology, they would have hallucinated the fact Jesus was either in heaven or that Jesus was in Abraham's bosom, which is a place that the Jews called, which was a separate compartment from hell where the unbelievers were at that time, the rich man and Lazarus. You see the rich man in hell and then Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And so they would have hallucinated Jesus one of those two places, not resurrected, walking around on earth with a physical body. It goes against everything they knew of theologically. And so they wouldn't have conjured up this image in this hallucination, let alone 500 of them. The fourth fact that is commonly accepted by all those that research the resurrection is that the religion of Christianity formed very rapidly. It's accepted that the religion, the way, or Christianity, rapidly grew in the first century from a small sect to over tens of thousands of believers. Over 3,000 people were converted on the day of Pentecost, merely just 50 days after the Passover. And Christianity quickly flourished over Roman provinces, from Israel to North Africa, all the way to westward of Italy, where Corinth is and everything else, everywhere in between, Turkey. Christianity spread very rapidly, and it was all focused around the event of Jesus Christ. So the critic's naturalistic explanation is the fact that the resurrection was merely a legend, that this is a legend that developed over a short period of time. But that has problems from everything we know of about legends. Number one, the disciples died a martyr's death. It's true while we see Muslims, faithful Muslims, they're not radical, they're orthodox Muslims believing in the Quran and the different hadiths and everything. Those faithful Muslims will die for jihad, and they will die a martyr's death for what they believe will grant them 72 virgins. But the disciples didn't die for what they believed. The disciples died for what they saw and what they knew about Jesus' physical resurrection. The fact that Jesus rose was evidence to them that he was who he said he was. It makes no logical sense for these disciples, these Jews, to create a religion called Christianity that pretty much takes the Old Testament law and sets it aside and says Jesus fulfilled all this law, to bring to them persecution and martyrdom for a lie, if they lied about it, whether they stole the body, hallucinated, whether they misplaced the body, whatever the case is. If they knew that this wasn't true, it makes no sense that they would have fabricated this and died for this lie. What we know about legendary theories is the fact that there was not enough time for this legend to develop. We just looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul, he recites a very early creed of the early disciples, maybe just a few years after the crucifixion. That is sufficiently not enough time for a legend to develop. A.N. Sherwin-White, Roman Greek historical scholar at Oxford, says that he studied the rate of which legends accumulated in the ancient war, using Herodotus as a test case. He states that 2 generations, around 80 years, is not enough time for a legend to wipe out historical facts and develop myth. See, that's key. In order for a legend to be accepted, a myth to be accepted, it has to remove all historical facts, all of it. And in 80 years, A.N. Sherwin White says that that is not enough time for a legend to develop. And we know that the earliest writings are around AD 50, 53, only about 20 years after the crucifixion. And yet we see evidence that there's creeds much earlier than that. There's sufficiently not enough time for a legend to develop. For a legend to replace all historical facts surrounding Christianity, this legend couldn't have developed any earlier than around 120 AD. But we have writings, we have beliefs, we have church liturgy, if you will, much earlier than that. Whether it's Josephus, whether it's Tacitus. And so saying that this rose out of a legend is complete contrary to everything researchers know about legends. Also, any legendary tale, even within the first couple decades, would have been very easily discredited by the historical facts of Jesus' death and resurrection. When Paul and Barnabas and Paul and Silas went around on the missions trip in the book of Acts, you see that there's a ragtag bunch of Jewish leaders that are following them, trying to chase them and kill them. What would make much more sense to me is rather than them just trying to kill these people and snuff out that Jesus physically rose from the dead, is they would have just stopped there and told people, no, he didn't, the body's over there, go check it out, whatever the case is. And that's not what happened. They continually tried to squash their preaching of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Nowhere do we get any evidence that Jesus arose wounded or that anybody ever showed the body of Jesus Christ. So any legendary tale that was spread could have been easily discredited. Hey Bob, I was just at the Passover last year, and I saw Jesus' body in the tomb. So what they're saying here, that he actually rose? No, I saw it. That's never happened. We don't have any information about that. So the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. These 4 facts, just take them, put them in your pockets, whatever the case is. Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. The tomb was discovered empty. The disciples believed they saw resurrected Jesus, and Christianity formed rapidly. These are 4 historical facts that are very much predominantly accepted by anybody that researches the resurrection. And by looking at these, you see the naturalistic explanations on, okay, we don't believe in the supernatural, so this is how it could have happened through natural means. Each of those theories have problems and major holes in each of them. Abductive reasoning. What is the most plausible and reasonable explanation for these? Swoon theory, misplaced body, stolen body, hallucination, legend. Again, all of those have major holes in them. Unless one opens up the possibility of the supernatural, they will never, ever come to the realization of the resurrection. They will remain blind and ignorant of the great love that Jesus has for them, in which he's shown at the cross 2,000 years ago. I'm going to leave you with this. Blaise Pascal said, in faith, there's enough light for those who want to believe and enough shadows to blind those who don't. The resurrection, it's not about evidence. It's a matter of searching and believing. And it's unfortunate that there's a lot of you out there that don't even want to search or consider, but we're just going to regurgitate what we've heard and not even consider the evidence. So I pray, if that's you, that you would, repent from that, that you would actually look into the evidence for yourself. Because in the end, we're not going to give an account for what we were told. We're going to give an evidence for what we knew, what we believed. So there you have it, the last of the 4-part series. I hope you enjoyed this and everything. New Testament eyewitness reliabilities. We can definitely tell how the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, not later fabrications made about 40, 50, 60 years later. We looked at the historicity of Jesus Christ, namely a blog by an atheist on 10 different ways he believes Jesus Christ never existed, and we refuted each of those. We looked at what day Jesus was crucified, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And it's still my belief and understanding and argument that he was crucified on a Friday, because each of the Gospels really reference the Sabbath was coming that next day. Mark and Luke, if it was any other Sabbath writing to Gentiles, they would have explained that the Sabbath wasn't the weekly Sabbath, it was a different day of rest. But they don't explain that. They explain other stuff to Gentiles, but they don't explain that because to the Jews and to the Gentiles, they understood it was the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. And then here, this one, the minimal facts resurrection approach. So I hope these 4 facts here, if you want, look at all 12 of them. Like I said, Gary Habermas, he's a doctor at Liberty University. He made this famous. Yeah, actually, I believe he developed it. And then crossexamine.org, Frank Turek as well. So, like I said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this strengthened your faith in God. Or at least, if you're not a believer and you're looking at this, maybe this is giving you some things to consider about looking into the existence of God, the historicity of Jesus Christ, and was that tomb empty? Because as C.S. Lewis once said, with Jesus Christ, we're going to have to answer the question, who was Jesus? And we're going to have one of 3 answers. He was either a liar, lunatic, or Lord. And I pray you make the decision today that He is the Lord of your life. God bless.